Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to this webinar of the FAWEC, the Farm Animal Welfare Education Center. Before I get started, I would like to thank our sponsors. Without them, FAWEC activities would not be possible, so thank you very much indeed. This is incidentally the 7th webinar of FAWEC. If you want to know more about our activities, please visit our webpage. Now, this webinar is on pain in sheep. I will be talking for roughly 40 minutes. After that, we'll have a break for a few minutes, and after the break, I will do my best to answer your questions. Now, you are welcome to send questions either while I am talking or after my talk during the break. And please send questions through the webpage of FAWEC, so www.fawec.org. So this is the plan of the talk. I will start with an introduction to sheep welfare and pain. Then I will spend most of my time dealing with assessment and management of pain in sheep. And I will finish with a summary of the main ideas of the webinar. Now, as for the introduction, the first question I would like to address is whether pain is a major issue in sheep welfare. And sheep production is very diverse. We have a variety of production types, meat, wool, milk. We have a variety of management systems ranging from very extensive to intensive, and we have a variety of breeds. So it might be that welfare problems vary according to breed, production type, and management system. Now, in 2014, EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, published the scientific opinion on the welfare risks related to the farming of sheep. And according to this opinion, the main welfare problems for ewes do vary according to the management system, but across all systems, the main welfare problems are thermal stress, lameness, and mastitis. For lambs, the situation is slightly different. There were few differences reported among management systems in terms of the major welfare problems, and these were, again, thermal stress, painful husbandry practices, gastrointestinal problems, and neonatal disorders. So based on this EFSA report and on some other references as well, it is fair to say that regardless of the production type, the management system, and the breed, pain-related issues are very important for the welfare of sheep. And these issues include lameness and mastitis, for example, and also painful husbandry practices. Now, pain assessment and management in sheep should be seen as part of a wider strategy aimed at improving the welfare of sheep. And when trying to improve the welfare of sheep, we believe that a very useful tool is the AWIN Sheep Welfare Assessment Protocol. This protocol is freely available on the web and is based on the previous welfare quality protocols. The welfare quality protocols recognize 4 principles of good welfare. That's good feeding, good housing, good health, and appropriate behavior. For each of these 4 principles, the protocols have a number of criteria, and for each criteria, there is a number of indicators. Now, the AWIN protocol includes several pieces of information which are very relevant in the context of this talk. For example, lameness assessment, mastitis assessment, the assessment of injuries and tail length, for example, and I will be referring to some of those during my presentation. Now, what are the main causes of pain in sheep? Well, pain in sheep may be caused by diseases and injuries. It may be caused as well by husbandry practices, and there is a possibility that lambing causes pain as well. And I will refer to this particular issue of lambing as a cause of pain later on in my talk. So let's talk a little bit about the painful husbandry practices. There are many. Some of them are very specific of some countries, and I will not deal with those. But there are two painful husbandry practices, which are castration and tail docking, which are rather common across a number of countries in different places of the world. Now, castration and tail docking are done for different reasons. In the particular case of castration, it is to improve meat quality, and this depends very much, of course, on the age at which male lambs are slaughtered. Another reason for castration is the control of mating and the reduction of aggressive behavior. Now, for tail docking, I think it is fair to say that still today, in many places, tail docking is done out of tradition. But beyond this, the main reason for tail docking is to control blowfly strike. Now, I am dealing with these reasons for painful husbandry practices because we have to remember that regardless of the method we use, and we shall see more about this later on, regardless of the method we use, castration and tail docking are painful indeed. So consequently, before we do this, we have to consider whether there is any good reason for either castration or tail docking. In some cases, I think the answer is very clear. I assume that nobody would deny that doing tail docking because of tradition is not acceptable on animal welfare grounds. So that's very clear. But in some other cases, the discussion may be a little bit more difficult. And one example of this is tail docking as a strategy to reduce the risk of blowfly strike. Now, blowfly strike might be a problem, a major economic and welfare problem in different parts of the world. So the fly that appears on this slide here is one of the species that causes blowfly strike. It's the main species in Europe. There are other species in other parts of the world. And apart from the distress that the fly and the larva cause to the animals, there is weight loss, reduced fertility, and in severe cases, death. So as I said, it's obviously a major welfare problem. It can be as well a major economic problem. In some cases, the percentage of animals affected is rather high. But my message here is that before we do or we decide to do tail docking to reduce the risk of blowfly strike, we have to consider whether blowfly strike is indeed a problem. And the key thing here is that this consideration has to be done on a flock-by-flock basis. So the importance of blowfly strike is different depending on where in the world you are, obviously, but even within a given geographic area, the severity of the problem may be very different among flocks. And this can be due to the genotype of the animals, can be due to other management aspects, and so on. So first message here is, before considering the convenience of tail docking, please assess the importance of blowfly strike in your particular flock, in your particular circumstances. But there is a second aspect here, and that is that even if blowfly strike is indeed a problem in a given flock, then the second thing you should consider is whether tail docking is going to be useful. And the evidence on this, the evidence on the effect of tail docking on blowfly strike is rather conflicting. Now, just to give you an example, we have like two different ways of approaching this issue. One is to do experimental studies, and only 1 out of 3 published experimental studies on the effect of tail docking on blowfly strike, only 1 out of 3 found clear evidence of an effect. The other approach would be to look at epidemiological studies, and then, to make a long story short, I think the summary is that according to most of these epidemiological studies, tail docking does not explain differences in fly strike, at least to a large extent. So I don't want to be very prescriptive here, but my suggestion would be, before doing tail docking, please think twice. First, consider whether blowfly strike is a problem in your flock. And second, even if it is, consider whether other management strategies may be more useful than tail docking to reduce the risk of blowfly strike. Now, husbandry practices are one of the causes of pain in sheep. Another important cause is diseases, and among those, probably lameness and mastitis are the 2 major medical causes of pain in sheep. And then we have another potential reason of pain in sheep, which is lambing. And this is a rather interesting area, we believe, but unfortunately, there are very few, if any, studies on pain caused by lambing. Now, if we look, however, at other species, I think there is very clear evidence that dystocia causes pain, and there is some evidence as well that even normal parturition may be painful, and possibly there is an effect of parity here. Let me show you the results of one study we did in our vet school some time ago. This study was done in cattle, not in sheep. So I am using cattle here as a model, if you wish. And what we look at was at the aptoglobin concentration in plasma. Aptoglobin is a marker of inflammation, so we were not assessing pain per se, we were looking at inflammation, but it is well known that inflammation causes pain. So as you can see in this slide here, is that in the particular case of heifers, in blue, even 15 days after a normal calving, the concentration of aptoglobin was significantly higher than the baseline level. So we can conclude that for heifers, 2 weeks after normal calving, they were still in an inflammatory state, very likely painful. The situation was not as bad for cows as it was for heifers, but even for cows, after 4 days, at least 4 days after a normal calving, they were still in an inflammatory state. So this is cattle, not sheep. I am just drawing your attention to this study because we believe that lambing may well be an important cause of pain in sheep and is an area that we think deserves further attention. Okay, so far the introduction to sheep welfare and pain, with the main causes of pain in sheep, the discussion on whether tail docking and castration are needed, and the issue of lambing. Let's talk now a little bit on the assessment of pain in sheep, how we assess pain. And this is important not only because if we are good at assessing pain, we will be able to identify animals that need treatment, but also because if we have good and easy assessment methods, it is very likely that awareness of pain in sheep will increase, and that is going to be good for the welfare of the animals, obviously. Now, the problem, however, is that assessing pain in animals is far from easy. And it is far from easy because pain has an emotional component. And from an animal welfare standpoint, it is that emotional component what is the most important. And assessing emotions in animals is not easy. Now, in humans, the gold standard of pain assessment is self-reporting. But clearly enough, self-reporting is not possible in animals. So what do we do with animals then to assess whether they are in pain? Well, we have several possibilities. One is to look at physiological indicators, and that would include, for example, biochemical markers, changes in hormones, measures of hyperalgesia. These are potentially useful, but basically in an experimental setting. If we look, for example, at the most commonly used physiological marker of pain, that's cortisol in plasma. Cortisol in plasma has to be used with caution, but it can nevertheless provide very useful information on pain, and I will refer to several studies that have used cortisol as a measure of pain. But I think it is true not only for cortisol, but also for all the other physiological measures that they are useful in an experimental setting and not so much in practice. Now, when we want to assess pain in practice, we are left then with behavioral changes and also with facial expressions. So for many years, behavioral changes were the main indicator, perhaps the only practical indicator of pain in animals on farm studies. And basically, we can have general changes in behavior. And by general changes in behavior, I mean behavioral changes that will happen regardless of the cause of pain. And these would include, for example, a decrease in feed intake and in rumination time, would include, for example, changes in posture to avoid moving or causing contact to a painful body area, a decrease in social interactions, grinding teeth and curling lips, or licking, rubbing, or scratching painful areas. So those would be general changes in behavior, which are useful indicators of pain in many of the situations where sheep may feel pain. And then we have what we may call specific changes in behavior, which are changes that happen only when sheep feel pain due to a particular cause of pain. And this is a very classical, good study by Maloney and colleagues looking at the validation of a method to assess acute pain in lambs, and they basically look at changes in posture to assess a pain in the rear part of the lamb's body. Another example of these, of course, would be the specific changes in behavior we use to assess the severity of lameness, and this comes from the AWIN protocol, basically looking at head nodding, stride length, weight bearing, and another, all of them behavioral, to classify lameness as non-existing, minor, intermediate, or severe lameness. So this is behavior, and remember, we have some general changes that will occur regardless of the cause of pain, and some more specific changes which pertain to one particular cause of pain, be it pain in the rear part of the body or pain associated to lameness, for example. Now, the other very interesting tool we have to assess pain in sheep in practice is facial expressions. And probably most of you are familiar with this work. It started in 2010 with a paper on facial expressions in mice, in laboratory mice. And basically, after developing this scoring system based on facial expressions for mice, the system has been applied to other species. And in general, it has been found to be valid and reliable. And also, and this is a very important point, has been found to require minimal time. And I'm saying it's an important point because behavior, which is what I was explaining just 1 minute ago, is clearly important to assess pain. But the problem with behavior is that first, you need very often a lot of time to quantify behavior. And the second problem is that many times you need trained observers to identify the changes you want to see to assess pain. And with facial expressions, time required may be less, and apparently training might be minimal as well, the required training. Now, the question then, obviously, is whether this can be applied to sheep. And the answer is yes. In a paper published in 2016, McLennan and colleagues developed a scoring system based on facial expressions of sheep to assess pain, and they validated this scoring system using a pain caused by mastitis and foot rot. And one of the main findings of the study is that the inter-observer reliability was very high and minimal training was required. So the authors of the paper concluded that using facial expressions to assess pain in sheep was a reliable and effective method after minimal training. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what the facial expressions in sheep are in terms of pain assessment, you can look at the animals from a lateral view, and then there are basically 4 traits you have to look for. One is eye tightening. The other one, number 2 here, would be the degree of cheek tightening, then the position of the ears, and then finally, number 4, lip and jaw profile. And all of these change depending on the intensity, the severity of pain the animal is experiencing. And this, I said that before, has been validated in the McLennan study using mastitis and foot rot. If you look at sheep frontal view, then again you have two items, the ear position, which has to be assessed from the lateral and from a frontal looking, and then the nostril and philtrum shape. And with these 6 items, you may end up having a score which will provide very useful and valid information on what is the intensity of pain the animals are feeling. So in summary, to assess pain in sheep, we do have biochemical, physiological markers, cortisol, for example, hyperalgesia. They are fine, but they are useful, particularly in an experimental setting. In practice, we have to look for behavioral changes and facial expressions. Behavioral changes can be either general, so applicable to any cause of pain, or specific for some causes of pain. And then facial expressions, after the study by McLennan and colleagues, have been shown to be potentially a very useful tool to assess pain in sheep. Great, so we move now to the third part of the presentation, which is management of pain in sheep. And by management, what I mean is what are the main factors which may modify the intensity of pain in sheep. And in this particular section of the presentation, I will deal only with pain caused by husbandry practices, in particular, castration and tail docking. So the objective now is to see which factors modify the severity of pain caused by tail docking and castration. And I will look at 3 different factors. These are age of the animals, method used to do the procedure, and then whether analgesia and local anesthesia are used. Now, let's look at the effect of age first. And here, I think we have three relevant questions. The first one is whether there is any age difference in pain perception. So whether very young lambs are more or less sensitive to pain than older lambs. The second question is whether early pain or pain early in life may increase pain sensitivity later on. And finally, whether pain may interfere with colostrum intake and bonding between the lamb and baby. So let's go for the first one. Is there any age difference in pain perception? Well, this issue has received a lot of attention in both human and veterinary medicine. And I think that in human medicine is now very clear that even very premature infants can show a response to pain stimulant. So there is no doubt about it. Now, information about sheep is perhaps less extensive, and we have a number of possible confounding factors. One is that depending on whether we look at behavioral or physiological indicators of pain, the evidence can be a little bit conflicting. An important issue is that even if we found that older animals seem to show a greater response, that could be due to higher pain sensitivity, but also and simply to a higher amount of tissue being removed. And then the other thing is that male and female sheep may evolve differently as they age in terms of pain sensitivity. And this is a rather interesting phenomenon that has been shown in several papers, and this is one of them, for example. And this paper shows that pain sensitivity changes with age, but it does that in a different direction depending on whether you are looking at male or female lambs. So it's a difficult question, a lot of confounding factors, but to make a long story short again, I think a fair summary of the current evidence could be as follows. First, age has very little, if any, effect on pain sensitivity. So there is a similar or a very similar pain perception regardless of age. And therefore, castration and tail docking should always be considered painful practices, even if they are done on very young animals. Now, the second question related to age is whether pain very early in life may increase pain sensitivity later on or even for life. And there is some evidence in humans, I would say, quite convincing evidence in humans showing that indeed early experience of pain makes people more sensitive to pain later on in life. So early pain has long-term consequences for pain sensitivity. Now, studies in farm animals are very few, but we do have some which I think are very telling and very, very interesting. And I would like to refer to this one in particular by McCracken and colleagues, 2010. And basically, what they did was to start with 45 lambs. Half of them, roughly, were castrated at 1 day of age, so pain very early in life. And the second group was castrated at 10 days of age. Now, lambs from both groups were tail docked at roughly 1 month of age. And the main finding of the study was that tail docking at 1 month of age was more painful in those animals that had experienced pain very early in life. So in those animals that were castrated at 1 day of age. So this is one of the studies that strongly suggest that in farm animals, in sheep in particular, early pain may modify pain sensitivity for life, or at least have a long effect on pain sensitivity. And this is clearly a good reason to be extremely careful when doing painful husbandry practices in very young animals. It is not only the pain you cause when you do the practice, but also the fact that you may end up increasing pain sensitivity in that particular animal for a long time, perhaps for life. Now, the third and last question related to this issue of age is whether pain felt by very young lambs may interfere with colostrum intake and bonding with the ewe. And the answer to this question is yes, it certainly may. And this is why in a number of guidelines, it is recommended that practices such as castration and tail docking are done once the lamb has established the bond with its mother and it has drunk colostrum, to avoid interfering with those two behaviors. Okay, so that's it as for age. Let's look now a little bit at the method that can be used to perform both castration and tail docking. Now, and again, I would like to emphasize this idea. It might be, and we do have some evidence showing that different methods of castration in particular can be more painful than others. That's fair enough. But perhaps the most important message is that regardless of the method, both castration and tail docking should always be considered painful practices. So I would add, regardless of the method and regardless of the age of the animal, both castration and tail docking should always be considered painful practices. Now, having said that, however, I think we do have some good evidence using cortisol and acute phase proteins. Remember, cortisol is probably the most widely used physiological marker of pain. Acute phase proteins such as aptoglobin reveal an inflammatory state. So based on cortisol, on acute phase proteins, and based on behavioral changes, it does seem that surgical castration is more painful than other methods. And probably this is the reason why the Farm Animal Welfare Council, in its report of 2008, recommends that surgical castration should be banned except on therapeutic grounds, and then should be done only by a veterinarian surgeon using pain relief. So surgical castration is probably worse than any other method of castration. Beyond this, the evidence is probably less clear when comparing other methods apart from the surgical castration. I think there are several aspects that deserve particular attention, and one of them is the possible use of a clamp plus a rubber ring, which some studies have shown to be advantageous in terms of reducing pain in the animal, particularly after some period of time. But again, we do have some practical and technical considerations, and I think that we should look into this in more detail, particularly before recommending this as a general practice in on-farm conditions. Now, the evidence for the effect of method on pain caused by tail docking is probably not as conclusive as it is in the case of castration. We have several methods of tail dock lambs. It's surgical, using a knife, docking iron, rubber ring. When people have compared these different methods using behavioral changes, the problem, and that's a methodological problem, is that behavioral responses to pain seem to vary depending on the method, so comparisons are difficult. When people use cortisol instead of behavior, again, it seems that surgical tail docking is more painful, causes more distress than other methods. So the Farm Animal Welfare Council, for example, suggests that the preferred method may vary depending on age. Could be rubbering for very young lambs, hot iron for older lambs. And again, we have some areas deserving further research. One of those is the long-term implications of tail docking and whether there is any evidence of neuroma formation. And again, the possibility to use in field conditions combined methods such as clam and rubber ring, which might be useful, but again, we do have some practical and logistic considerations before recommending its wider use in field conditions. Now, another thing that we have to consider is that apart from the method we use to tail dog or to castrate, there are some other aspects, and some of those other aspects are equally important. And in the case of tail docking, one thing which is very relevant is the length of the remaining tail. And I think here there is quite a wide agreement that too short tails are not recommended, may be itself a welfare problem, and therefore the vulva should be covered when tail is held down. Otherwise, we talk about short dog tails, which are not recommended at all. And again, this piece of information comes from the AWIN protocols. And just to end up with this issue of how we do things, like castration and tail docking, just would like to draw your attention to this paper, which I think is a fascinating one, really interesting. We have known for many years about the social modulation of the stress response, so whether stress is modified by the presence of conspecifics, and now we have evidence showing that pain perception is also modified by the presence of conspecifics. And in this particular study, it was found that when lambs are subjected to a painful practice in presence of another lamb, the perception of pain may be less than when the same thing is done without the presence of a conspecific. So it's not how we do it, but also the social environment and obviously the physical environment as well, which may modify pain perception. Right, so this brings me to the last part of this section on management, which is using analgesia and local anesthesia when doing castration and tail docking. So remember, I said several times, castration and tail docking are painful regardless of the method, regardless of the age. So I think a clear advice is that always, or at least whenever possible, analgesia, and ideally analgesia and local anesthesia, should be used to reduce pain caused by tail docking and castration. And indeed, we do have very good evidence showing that both local anesthetics and NSAIDs, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, are useful to reduce pain caused by these two husbandry practices. Just to give you an example, I'd like to highlight this paper reporting on oral meloxicam to decrease behavioral changes related to pain after castration and tail docking. And I think perhaps the one of the most relevant findings of this paper is that meloxicam was found to be not only effective, but very effective indeed. I mean, basically at 8 hours after castration and tail docking, it was found a 7-fold reduction in behaviors which are indicative of pain when comparing meloxicam-treated animals with placebo-treated animals. And the effect of meloxicam was present as well 24 hours later when the study was terminated. So we don't know what happened later on, but at least in this study, the effect was present for a minimum period of 24 hours. So local anesthesia, NSAIDs are very useful. They should be used because we are dealing with very painful practices. And of course, there are some practical issues to be considered. And I think that timing is a key one. The duration of effect is a major consideration. And this is because castration and tail docking cause pain that can be relatively long-lasting, may last for several days, and yet the effect of most local anesthetics lasts a few hours only. And as for NSAIDs, the duration of the effect vary very much across different drugs. So I think it's important to remember that we want to cover the animal during a long period of time, several days. So local anesthetics can be very good to fight against the initial pain, but then we need NSAIDs, and the duration of effect of different NSAIDs can be rather different, and this has to be taken into consideration. So a final point is that obviously using NSAIDs will have welfare benefits, and this in itself is enough to recommend the use. On top of this, I think it is worth mentioning that we have evidence in other species, because there are very few studies in sheep, but we have evidence in other species, in cattle, for example, that the use of NSAIDs will bring a production benefit as well. So good welfare and a production benefit will go hand in hand when we talk about the use of NSAIDs. And for example, several papers in cattle report that when NSAIDs are used to treat mastitis, as opposed to using only antibiotics, when antibiotics are combined with NSAIDs, there is a reduction in culling rate and increased fertility. And the same applies to respiratory conditions. Animals that receive antibiotics and NSAIDs have an increased growth rate compared with those that receive only antibiotics. So the possibility exists that the same production benefits apply to sheep, and I think that that would be an added value, the use of NSAIDs, apart from the main reason by and large, which is improving the welfare of the animals. Right, so this brings me to the last section of my talk, which is a very short summary, 12 ideas which summarize the content of the webinar. Pain is a major welfare issue in sheep, regardless of the management system. The main causes of pain in sheep include diseases, mainly lameness and mastitis, and husbandry practices, mainly castration and tail docking, and some others as well, which are country-specific. The need to carry out painful husbandry practices should be assessed on a case-by-case basis or on a flock-by-flock basis, so shouldn't be given for granted. Further research is needed on pain caused by lambing. Practical pain indicators are needed to identify animals that require pain relief and also to raise awareness on pain in sheep. Facial expressions are valid and reliable method of pain assessment in sheep that require minimal training. Age has very little effect, if any at all, on pain sensitivity, and newborn lambs are able to experience pain. It seems that early pain experience has long-term effects on pain sensitivity. Apparently, surgical castration is more painful than other methods and is not to be recommended at all. Based on measurements of cortisol, surgical tail docking also seems to cause more distress than other methods. Both local anesthetics and NSAIDs are useful to reduce pain caused by castration and tail docking. And finally, based on work done in other species, treatment with NSAIDs is likely to have both welfare and production benefits. So thank you very much indeed for listening, for your attention. And now remember, we'll break for 4-5 minutes. And if you haven't done so, you are more than welcome to send your questions through the webpage address of FAWEG. So we reconvene in 5 minutes roughly, so at 10 minutes to 5 Central European time. So bye-bye for now. Okay, so welcome back to this webinar of work on pain in sheep. Before we start with the questions, and my colleague Dr. Deborah Temple will be reading out some of the questions you have sent. Let me tell you that the webinar will be available on our website starting next Monday. So from next Monday on, you or somebody else will be able to have a look, to listen the presentation. So, okay, so let's get started then with the questions. Deborah?
Yes, thank you very much, Xavier, for this very clear presentation. So yes, we have some questions here. So the first one for you about tail docking. So here is the question. If loud strike is not a problem in a country, what other important reasons exist that justify tail docking?
Okay, so when blowfly strike is not a problem in a country, what other reasons may justify tail docking? Well, that's an interesting question. I think, let me answer that question in two phases. One is what reasons are given to do tail docking when blowfly strike is not the problem. And I think that the two main reasons which are advocated are perhaps the three main reasons I heard of. One, tradition. We have always done it like this. Second one is, and this only applies, the second one only applies to dairy use, is to make milking easier. And another one which I heard of is that idea that tail docking will make mating easier, and otherwise with a full tail, males will have difficulties in mounting the females. So these are the reasons that are given. Now, your question was, which reasons justify tail docking? Well, my answer would be none of those would justify tail docking on animal welfare grounds. Clearly enough, I don't think that a tradition justifies something which is painful. I think there are many other ways to make milking easy. And finally, I don't think we have any evidence to say that we have to tail dock to allow animals to have a normal reproductive behavior. So from an animal welfare standpoint, my view on tail docking is none of these other reasons is solid enough or acceptable. And the issue of tail docking when blowfly strike is a problem still, even in that particular case, remains controversial for the reasons I tried to explain.
Yes, thank you. Let's go on with our second question. So it is also related to tail docking and also to castration. So here is the question. At which age would you recommend castration and tail docking?
Right, that's another rather interesting question. I think we have different elements to consider here. One is that, as I said, there is no significant age effect on pain sensitivity. So, but on the other hand, it is true that the larger the animal, the more tissue you remove, and the larger the lesion can be when you castrate or tail dock. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if lambs are very young, extremely young, pain caused by castration and tail docking may interfere with colostrum intake and bonding with the ewe. So one recommendation which is given, for example, by Falk, and I adhere to that completely, I think it's a good recommendation, is do it as soon as you can, provided the animal is older than 24 hours, and therefore it has gone through the process of colostrum intake and bonding with the ewe. But after that, do it as soon as you can, not because younger animals are less sensitive to pain than older ones, but simply because smaller animals will require less tissue being removed. Having said this, remember that regardless of the age you select, you should, whenever possible, use local anesthetics and NSAIDs to reduce pain.
Thank you, Xavier. So now here is the third question about facial expression. So would you recommend the use of facial expressions in field conditions?
Right. Yes, I would. I think that the evidence we have about the validity and reliability of facial expression scoring systems is very convincing indeed. And it has been shown that they, using these scoring methods based on facial expressions, requires very little training. So my opinion is that it would be extremely good to implement this system in practice on farms, and this has been done with very different animals, with lab rats and mice, for example. Many institutional animal care and use committees in many countries use facial expressions, and they have drawings or pictures of the different items you have to look at to score the facial expression, and these are used in practice to assess pain in laboratory rodents. And I think that it would be very good to develop this system and to implement such a system on farm conditions to identify animals in need of pain relief in sheep production. So clearly, my answer to this question is yes, I would recommend it.
Thank you very much, Xavi. We ran a little bit out of time, so we will stop the questions now. Just tell you that we will respond to your questions by email. And so thank you very much for this webinar.
Okay, so thank you very much, Deborah. Thank you again to our sponsors, and thank you for listening. Please go and have a look to our webpage to learn more about our activities. So bye-bye now.